This is the Canon EOS R7, and depending on how you look at it, it is either an incredibly well-spec'd consumer-grade camera with an APS-C sensor or a woefully underwhelming professional camera with an APS-C sensor. And a year ago when Canon released this camera, I was very close to getting out of the Canon camera ecosystem altogether after over a decade of being either a sometimes satisfied or frustrated Canon shooter, because I was wanting to get into professional freelance video production, and Canon did not have a camera in its entire lineup just last year that satisfied my requirements for doing professional video work, which are, a camera that can shoot 10-bit video at 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, preferably without an additional crop, from a stabilized sensor to redundant media for an unlimited amount of time. And while that may seem like a bougie list of requirements, those are the things the camera features that I use in my professional video work every day, and there are plentiful offerings from other manufacturers that satisfy those requirements. But when Canon released this camera, there was nothing at any price point among its mirrorless cameras that had that capability. So I was pleasantly surprised when Canon brought the R7 to market last year, satisfying not only those requirements, but piling onto that with great stills capabilities, to shoot 33 megapixel RAW files at either 30 frames per second or 15 frames per second with a fully mechanical shutter and state-of-the-art autofocus system, and wrapping all of that up in a nice, sturdy, weather-sealed body with great battery life. Well, that's just the cherry on the ice cream on the cake, isn't it? So I was poised to buy this as soon as it was announced. I got one of the very first copies that arrived in the United States, fortunately, and I was eager to share the results of my initial test with the camera with you guys on YouTube. And over the last year, I've basically built an entire micro production house around this camera. So I've got a lot of experience with it, and in this video I would like to share my experiences with you, show some of the media that I've been able to create with it, tell you my impressions, the things that I like about it and the things that I hate about it. I think those would be maybe of most interest to you who are considering purchasing the R7 for the first time a year later. Maybe we'll also talk about whether it still holds the prestigious place that it has in the camera market with a year of new camera offerings, both from Canon and from other manufacturers. And for those of you who are more familiar with the camera, I also intend in this video to comb back through the initial review videos that I made last year for comments that ask unanswered questions. And so in this video, I'm also going to address the 3 most frequently asked unanswered questions about the Canon R7. So, Canon EOS R7, is it still the one 1 year later? Let's talk about it. Right, take a seat, grab a drink, let's have a chat. So you can see I've got the R7 configured here for some wildlife photography. I've got the EF 100 to 400 millimeter, f 4.5 to 5.6 LIS USM Mark II zoom lens mounted up, which is, my preferred wildlife configuration. The reason I have it set up for wildlife is to address the first most frequently asked unanswered question about the R7 that I've received, which is, should I use it with a teleconverter or should I just crop the photos? Now, this may seem like more of a wildlife photography question, generally not a question about the R7, but the R7 is also, among even crop sensor cameras, a very high resolution camera. And so knowing that teleconverters do tend to introduce some optical imperfections and artifacts, I think that naturally leads to the question, well, can I potentially get a better result just by cropping into all of those 33 megapixels that the R7 offers? So I've brought it out here to one of my favorite birding spots, and hopefully we're gonna get some bird positions or some birds that are static or stationary enough that I can get similar shots with or without the teleconverter. And if not, I'll just shoot into this tree scene and see, we can pull up the files later, see if there's a dramatic difference in sharpness or image quality with the teleconverter or by just cropping into the resolution of the sensor. We'll see what the result is, and then I'll tell you why I almost always use the teleconverter on the R7 when I'm shooting telephoto work. My reasoning is not exclusively limited to image quality. All right, welcome to the studio. This Is it obvious that I've been basically living in here? I'm glad that I was able to frame this so that you can't see that side of the room. So yeah, I've been knocking out a lot of work here, and actually been doing a lot of that work here on the R7. So that's something I haven't mentioned, but maybe it's worth bringing up for the first time in this video over the last... But I know you guys want to see these example images. Okay, so these are the photos that we made together out in the woods. I've got them stacked up and auto-aligned in Photoshop, so you can see these are the 3 photos, and I'll tell you which is which here in a second, but maybe I should let you decide which one you like best first. So we'll say number 1, number 2, and number 3. I'm not sure how well this is going to be interpreted on YouTube, but to my eye, it's pretty obvious that our sharpest result is photo number 1. And this even surprised me because I thought this would be, you know, a closer comparison. But number 1 is the teleconverter shot, and that's presented here at, it looks like maybe about 150%. The crop photos are cropped in 200%. And the first one is a crop of the shot at f8. So when I switched the teleconverter out, the camera maintained exposure at f8. And then I decided also to open up the aperture to f5.6 and compensate with shutter speed to see if maybe I could get an advantage from subject motion. But as you can see, the blurriest of all of the shots was the lens at f5.6 and cropped in. Right, this isn't an extensive scientific test where we tested all the focal lengths and different focus points. So the results can vary quite a bit depending on all of those factors. But as I mentioned, I'm in the habit of using the teleconverter regardless of whether I get the sharpest shot, and that is because it enlarges the subject with relationship to the autofocus point. So when I'm shooting without the teleconverter, I'll notice, and you probably noticed this as well, that the autofocus point will cover not only the subject, but maybe even a considerable amount of area around the subject. And so I don't have confidence that it's necessarily picking the right thing within the autofocus point to focus on. Whereas if I put the teleconverter on, not only does it magnify the subject with relationship to the autofocus point so that I have a more precise understanding of exactly what is going to be focused on, but also as the subject moves through the frame, it's going to be hitting more autofocus points and giving the camera the best advantage possible to track it across the frame. So I find that I get a better autofocusing result using the teleconverter, even though the camera is getting less light. And I know that some of you have commented that you've had bad experiences using the teleconverter. I presume the comments you've left are from your own experiences using the teleconverter and getting a worse autofocus point, but I can only speak from my experiences, and I find that, you know, you'll notice that Canon is releasing telephoto lenses at as tight of an aperture as f11. So I think that with these mirrorless cameras, they're more advantaged by having a more prominent subject or a larger subject to focus on than by having as much light as possible. Of course, more light is always better, but I think the cameras are perfectly capable of autofocusing at f8, and the best chance in my experience that I've seen to give the autofocus system an advantage is to make the subject more prominent in the frame, and that's where the teleconverter helps me out a lot. Okay, I promised you guys I would whine about the R7 a little bit, so let me get it down and I'll show you some of the things that I'm not crazy about it. I give it glowing reviews all the time. I think it's an underrated camera, but of course there's always room for improvement, so I'll point out the viewfinder resolution is maybe a bit low for my taste. Not only do I have difficulty gauging focus with the viewfinder, but also with the rear screen, and even tethered into the computer, I find that it seems like it's sort of dumbing itself down. I think this behavior can be changed or optimized in the settings, but I really feel like I've played with all the settings, and also there's an issue where like sometimes it's sharp and sometimes it's blurry. It's too confusing for me anyway. So I could point out that I have heard some complaints about this control layout where you'll be working one of the exposure dials here and a dial that surrounds the autofocus point selector joystick. I actually like it, and I've heard more praise than complaints. So I just thought it was worth putting that out there, that may be something you like or dislike. of people that I know that have used the camera or given themselves opportunity to adjust to the control layout. They generally like it.
After using the R7 in the field a number of times, I've grown to actually really like this control dial and joystick by your thumb. It's just extremely handy. It's close to the AF on button, and I actually prefer it now.
Strangely enough, I wasn't a big fan of that wheel around the joystick in the beginning. But now whenever I use the R7 and then I go back to like an R5 or an R3, my thumb kind of wants that wheel at the top of the camera because it's kind of the natural position, and then otherwise I always have to kind of reach down.
So goes to show, once you try things, sometimes you change your opinion.
What I dislike, and this probably would be my last complaint about the camera, is that it is a 2-dial camera. So you don't have an independent dial to control the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. There are only 2 dials. So I feel like this camera is marketed to an audience that would pay the extra to have the 3rd dial, like myself, if it were integrated into the camera. So if this camera cost an extra $100 and it gave me a full complement of control dials, that would be easily worth it. I think the camera is already a strong deal as it is. So some of you suggested that I may be less frustrated with the ISO control if I take the time to try out the FV, or flexible priority mode. This is a new control mode from Canon. I think maybe it's been out on all the mirrorless cameras, but definitely not something you'll find on a DSLR. So I'm going to call this the second most frequently asked unanswered question, is like, what about flexible priority shooting mode? So let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, we'll turn the camera on in FV mode. The first thing you notice is that it's got these instructions, which is really helpful because this is not the most intuitive mode. If you've ever used a Fuji camera that has a discrete button for each exposure setting, a discrete dial, and I could talk to you like this. If you've ever used a Fuji camera that's got a discrete dial for each exposure setting, and the dial can be positioned between a setting or auto, FV mode works like that. So you use this dial. If I can work it from in front of the camera. So you use this dial to change between the exposure settings. And when you have a setting selected, then you can use the front dial to change that setting. And again, so it looks like I've got exposure compensation selected. But anyway, you can change that setting to a value or to auto. Right, so here I'm going to switch the aperture from auto to f4, and you can see now I'm controlling exposure with aperture, but I've also got the shutter speed set to auto. Anyway, if you hit the trash can button, you can change the setting back to auto, and then if you press and hold the trash can button, you can change all the settings back to auto. So that's FV mode in a nutshell. You can see how this could be a more streamlined process to controlling the ISO by leaving the settings that you don't want to control in auto, and then you can sort of switch back and forth and change the ISO. Maybe you can imagine a use case that would work for you for this, but for me this is not where it's at, because this process is way too slow. For one thing, you can only change one exposure setting at a time. So a lot of times when I'm shooting, especially like events and stuff, and when I show you an example of some of the video work that I've done, I think you'll get a good sense of this. I'll be like whipping up the camera, and I've sort of got this muscle memory where like I'll be, maybe I see something that's fast action, and I'll be like winding down the shutter speed and opening up the aperture like at the same time. So you get this muscle memory of like changing at least 2 exposure settings at a time. And I will often shoot with my EOS R, which has got a top screen, and so I can actually sort of be gauging my exposure before I even bring the camera to my eye. I'm making the adjustments that I needed, and then when I'm just fine tuning once I get the camera to my eye. With the flexible priority mode, not only can you only change one setting at a time, but you have to get the camera to your eye before you can even see what your exposure settings are. And then I have to, like, there's an adjustment period where I have to like put my eye off of the subject and down to the exposure settings to figure out what the exposure setting that I'm changing is even selected to, and then move this wheel to select the correct setting that I want to adjust, and then adjust that setting, and then move it back to the next setting. It's so for me, and the way I like to shoot it is way too slow, and I don't find this to be very useful, but just wanted to point it out to you. Some viewers pointed it out to me in the comments of a video, and so that actually their suggestion was the first time I tried it out, and I wanted to share it with you. I actually have a solution for controlling ISO that works much better for me, and I'll share that with you right now. Okay, so what I do is I go into the menu to this page where you can customize the buttons. So this is whatever this is, page 3, and then I go down to customize buttons. And this button that is star shape to this option here, which is ISO in the down, that's a press, that's supposed to mean press and hold. So that makes it when you press and hold this button, and manipulate the front dial, you're changing the ISO. For me, that is a really easy muscle memory, and if at all, only marginally slower than having a dedicated dial to control the ISO. Okay, before I get into my last most frequently asked unanswered question about the R7, I told you that I would show you some examples of some stuff that I've made with it over the last year, and I was ruminating on how to do this, and I think maybe, I apologize if this is too advert. It's not my goal to like go out client seeking here, but the best way that I could think of to do that was just to show you my like promo reel for my production company. So I'm just gonna reel that for you now. Enjoy, I'll catch up with you afterwards. Last unanswered question is like, what's up with this HDR PQ mode? It's a high dynamic range picture quality mode, and the reason I think this gets asked is there are two 10-bit recording modes on the Canon R7, and if you're outside these modes, if you're recording in one of the regular Canon picture profiles, you're just getting an 8-bit video file. And so your options for 10-bit are either C-Log3 or HDR PQ. So the intended purpose of HDR PQ is to capture HDR footage and deliver it directly to an HDR display, which is super cool, but you know, most people are not editing for HDR displays and they're rectifying their footage into a standard dynamic range profile like Rec. 709. So I think the like HDR recording and delivery pipeline is simple enough that, you know, that doesn't require a lot of elaboration. The reason I think people are curious about HDR PQ is they say, well, C-Log3 is a 10-bit profile with extended dynamic range that I have to grade in, to be rectified to a SDR display. HDR PQ is a 10-bit profile that I could potentially grade to be rectified into an SDR display. Can I just use them interchangeably, or is there perhaps a time where it's advantageous to use HDR PQ the way that I would use C-Log3? I don't know exactly the answer to that because I've did a lot of research on HDR PQ. I've gotten a lot of conflicting information, and also I don't feel compelled to stray out of my C-Log workflow, which I'm satisfied with. So what I did to answer this the best that I could and maybe draw some conclusions is I took the camera out to a couple of events at sunset and I recorded footage in C-Log 3 and HDR PQ. The advice that I'm most confident in giving you from that experience was that it was a lot easier to grade C-Log 3 to a look. And while there were a few times that I did prefer the HDR PQ footage after grading it, I don't feel confident that I would know what those situations, those few situations were while shooting. And so in order to avoid shooting everything in both profiles for the rare event that the HDR PQ footage gives me the better grade, I think I would recommend just sticking with C-Log 3 unless you know you're going to be delivering to an HDR delivery. Another big disadvantage to the HDR PQ was that it was very saturated and the colors were sort of baked in. So I found that it was quite a bit less flexible when trying to make color adjustments or corrections to the HDR PQ footage. But anyway, that's a look at the two different recording formats if you're curious about that. So those are my thoughts on the R7 after a year. Probably my favorite strength of the camera is that it's just so dependable. And this is something that I tried to remark on in my initial reviews. I tested it against the R6. I've tested it against the R8. And among those cameras, and I've tested against the EOS R as well, and amongst those cameras that are sort of in that price class, the reason I kept going back to the R7, even though one camera may be better in some situation and one camera might have this advantage or that advantage, the reason I kept going back to the R7 is because it was so dependable. It's like it just wants to work all day. It rarely overheats. When it does overheat, it gives a good advanced warning of that with this graduated temperature gauge that's very helpful. It gets great battery life. It never locks up or freezes, which is a problem that I had intermittently with the R6 when I reviewed that camera. It's just really dependable, and it's also quite durable, and I have confidence just throwing it in a backpack and getting out and making stuff with it, which is what I want to do with my camera. It's like the absolute best ratio of output quality to sassy camera backtalk to price for me, not just among all the Canon cameras, but really uniquely in this price point. So other cameras you might consider, since the camera is released, there's the Fuji XS20, as well as two Fuji XH series cameras. Now the XH series cameras I think are probably better cameras, but they're also more expensive. So you've got to keep that in mind. You get more features, but you pay for those more features. The XS has some cool benefits. It can do 6K video, 6K raw video, if I'm not mistaken, externally. It can do 12-bit video, right? So if you're primarily just interested in video quality, the XS20 I think is a strong contender that's worth considering, but there are some compromises there with stills. It's a slower shooting camera, maybe 6 frames per second or something like that. So if you need a camera that's more hybrid or a little more balanced, good at both stills and video, then I think the R7 is probably the better option. Sony is about to refresh its APS-C camera line, so at the time of recording this video, the R7 is probably better than any Sony camera that you would consider, for my money anyway, but that may change, so keep an ear out if you're interested in Sony. And then as far as I'm concerned, there's really no Nikon camera at this price point that's worth considering, so a year later, the R7 is still a really strong contender, and I think you should definitely consider it if you want to get to work with the camera. Okay, that wraps it up for this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the review. Of course, I've got affiliate links below if I helped you make a informed buying decision for the R7 or any of the recommended accessories that I have for it. I always welcome you to leave a thumbs up on the video if you found it helpful, and please be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can keep an eye on what I'm making with my R7. But until I see you next time, you guys keep an eye out and a foot forward, and thanks for watching. Bye.